Welcome back to Behavioral Science for Brands, a podcast where we connect academics and marketing. Every other week, Richard and I sit down and we talk about some of the country's greatest brands and the behavioral science that powers them. I'm Michael Aaron Flicker.
And I'm Richard Shotton.
And today we're talking about every child's favorite time of year, summertime. And specifically, summertime vacations and some of the behavioral science behind these ideas. Let's get into it. So, Richard, summertime vacations, the allure of good weather, of being outside. Is summertime vacations a big thing here in the UK?
Yeah, definitely. I'm not sure if my childhood memories are of great weather, though. Most of the time I spent in North Wales visiting my great aunts in Snowdonia. So beautiful scenery, horrendous weather.
The name is Snowdonia.
Yeah, like Snowdon is the tallest mountain in Wales, so the area is called Snowdonia.
And is it snowy in the winter?
It would be in the winter. I mean, this isn't a huge mountain. I think it's about 4,000 feet, so 1,500 metres maybe.
And the school year in the United Kingdom goes from when to when?
Oh, good point. Starts in September, ends early July, mid-July.
Early July. So in America, we would start in September and go anywhere to late May to late June, depending where you are in the country. So we have a little bit longer of a summer break. Mark Twain, famous American author, writer of Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer, kind of romanticizes the summer break and creates this idea that in America, the unstructured time of being out of school, being away from the classroom is where real learning happens. And that's kind of part of the American archetype now. It's part of the way we see the world. Summers is as important for British youth?
Yeah, everyone likes having time off school. I think they're not quite, as you say, they're not quite as long as they are in America.
Yeah.
But even then, there's evidence that suggests you have that long off from learning, and it has an impact, and it has a varied impact by wealth levels. So you see a increase in inequality in educational outcomes because of the long holiday. So there are downsides as well from a parental point of view.
Yeah. And there's been articles more recently in the American press. What if we were to change the length of the summer holiday? But what about the tourism industry? I mean, there's so much of the economy that is built around the cycle of 10 weeks of summer. It's really quite interesting. So today, we're looking at something a little different than we normally do. Normally, we take a brand, we take a campaign, we dissect it for the behavioral science that powers it. But today, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to look at the idea of vacations and holidays, and what are we going to do with it?
So we've each picked our favourite marketing campaign for a destination. We'll quickly explain what the campaign did, and then, as you say, the most important bit, what were the behavioural science principles behind it, and then how can those principles be used by other marketers. They'll have value beyond just the tourist industry.
Perfect. So let's get into the first one. You've chosen a really interesting case study.
So I've chosen the Palau Pledge. It was a campaign that started in 2017. Yeah. And Palau is a small Pacific island. Tourism is a massive part of their economy. The amount of tourists far outweighs the amount of citizens. So hugely valuable to them. But that vast number of tourists coming has a downside, and there's danger of environmental damage. So the very thing that attracts people is being destroyed by the scale of the attraction. So what they decided to do, December 2017, was change the stamp in the passport. So when you landed at the airport, you went up to the border guard, they put a stamp in your passport, but rather than just being a simple 1 inch by 1 inch block, it took up the whole page, and it was a 5-stanza poem that made a pledge. So it said things like, I vow to act kindly, tread carefully, and be aware of my actions, that type of thing. And then to enter the country, every single tourist had to sign that pledge. So they had to sign to say they would look after the environment, they wouldn't chuck their plastic bottles around, they wouldn't behave disgracefully. Now that's fascinating from a behavioural science point of view, because there is an idea that we are beholden to our active commitments. Mm-hmm. So there's a 2012 study, Steve Martin, who's at Columbia University, and he works with the NHS in Britain. The
National Health Services.
Yes.
Yep.
And the crucial difference is, all health services have to be paid for, but you can pay for them in different ways. In the UK, you pay for the health service out of your general taxation. So when you go to the doctor, there is no money exchanging hands. Yep. There's no bill.
Yep.
Brilliant in many respects. But one problem is that if you don't pay for something, you don't necessarily treat it with the respect it deserves.
You value it less.
And there's quite a high proportion of people who don't turn up to their appointments, and it wastes the government hundreds of millions of pounds. So Martin's interested in how can you reduce these no-shows. Now, what normally happens at the surgeries is patients come out of their initial appointment, they go to the receptionist, and the receptionist gives them a card with the time and date of the next appointment. That's the standard. And Martin monitors no-show rates in that setup. Then he introduces two interventions. The first intervention, when the patient comes out of that first appointment, they go and see the receptionist. Receptionist gives them the card, but they ask the patient to repeat back what's written on the card, what's the date and time they're going to turn up. Now, when they do that, there is a 3.5% reduction in no-shows.
And the big impact there is they're saying it out loud. They're
crucial.
making the commitment. Okay, so good.
And then that is crucial.
Yep.
Second intervention, the patient goes to the receptionist, they are given the card, but this time that card is blank, and the receptionist tells the patient to write down then and there when they're going to come back next.
Got it.
Now, in that setup, there is an 18% reduction in no-shows.
Bigger.
Much bigger.
Yeah.
Now, the argument from Martin is one of the big drivers of human behaviour is this desire to be consistent with our past self. But that bias is only tapped into if there is a degree of active participation. So if you're the patient and you passively, internally think, I will turn up when I get my card, that doesn't activate this bias of consistency. But if you either say something out loud or you write it down, then you feel strong cultural pressure to follow through on what you've stated. And the brilliance of the Palau Pledge is something that was essentially costless, tapped into this bias of consistency, made the commitment active and public, and therefore people were held to account from their own behaviour.
Yeah, and as you're sharing the story, I'm thinking about other ways ministries of preservation or tourism boards can approach this. I was in the Dominican Republic a few months ago, and as you arrive, you queue up and you wait to get your passport stamped. But instead of a pledge, they have a $10 fee to restore the beaches and maintain it. And as I was waiting, I was thinking to myself, does this make me feel like I've already covered my responsibility? That I paid to make sure that we're restoring the beaches and keeping the DR beautiful. And does that lessen my focusing on my own actions even more? Does it have a reverse effect?
I mean, that's a fascinating one. So there is a Israeli economist, behavioural scientist called Ghanesi, and he ran a study, it might be 1990s, early 2000s, and it was called When a Fine Becomes a Fee. And the basic finding was at a series of Israeli daycare centres, they were blighted by parents not turning up to pick their kids up on time. So there was a proportion of people who weren't turning up on time. They introduced a small fee, say $5, and the unintended consequence was more people turned up late. Now, what Ghanesi argues is it's very hard to have social and monetary obligations
That's what we're talking
act
about.
at the same time.
Yeah, that's what we're saying.
If you introduce money to the equation, you crowd out the social reasons for behaving properly. And what he said was happening at this daycare centre, most parents originally were making a big effort to try and get there on time, but sometimes life got in the way.
Sure.
Once the fee is introduced, or the fine, people think, well, they're at work, might look well on them if they, stay half an hour later and end up picking up the kids up late. And they think to themselves, well, is the burnishing of my career worth the $5? It became a
cost-benefit analysis.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think you're absolutely right. It's not that fees can't work, but if you introduce a small fee, you might end up encouraging the very behaviour that you want to stop, because you've given people this sense of license. They have paid for that right, and now they can exploit it. So I don't know whether it would have that effect, but I think you would certainly learn from the Ghanesi study that you should at least monitor those unintended consequences.
And so we have a audience here that is brand marketers, they're brand agency folks. How can they take the conversation we're having here and apply it to the commercial settings?
So the great thing is, I think you can apply this in lots of ways. I think you apply it on a one-to-one basis. If you're working with your team, and you ask someone to do something, don't accept passive nodding. Wait a beat. Ask them to, are you going to hit this on the 3rd of June? If you just leave it as something you've asked without an active response, don't expect it to happen. But if you get that verbal commitment, much more likely to do so.
Can I build on that and ask, just like the study, if they write it down, maybe more?
Maybe, yeah, absolutely more. It might, and this is the great thing. You've got these studies that show you the results in a certain setting.
Yeah.
You've then got to think how you apply them, and there's always a bit of a leap. Now, I wonder if in a work situation, would it feel a bit intrusive to say, get someone to write it down. Whereas I think you could probably leave that pause in the conversation, and people tend to fill it. That I think you could kind of put that into action more easily. Yeah. I bet you, absolutely. If there is a situation where writing it down is acceptable, maybe in a more formal brainstorming situation or a training session, then that would be preferable.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And the data would say more likely to make an impact.
Yeah, certainly the Steve Martin study.
Yeah. So we've got this one-to-one. Any other examples of where we can apply it commercially?
The other area that, and it might be Martin, it might be Cialdini, so Rob Cialdini and Steve Martin often work together. They've applied it with restaurants. Yeah. So restaurants have exactly the same problem. People make the booking, don't turn up. And either Martin or Cialdini introduced this idea to a restaurant where, when they were speaking to the guests booking their dinner, they said to them, look, will you let us know if you can't make it? And they trained the staff to pause so that the other person filled it. And what they're going to say, but
of course.
Yes, of course.
Yes.
And that reduced no-shows.
Interesting that you raise restaurants, because more and more common at fine dining is a very exorbitant fee if you were to miss $75 a head at a restaurant that we were looking at last week. So interesting that on the other extreme, rather than a small monetary amount, a meaningful monetary amount.
Yeah. And so going back to that point with Ghanesi fines, he wasn't saying that a fine won't affect behaviour.
Right.
But if the fine is smaller than the social obligation, then you have a problem. You start talking about $75, and it's
a big
amount.
Yeah. And you say to yourself, we have a party of 4. We're not going to lose $300 through a no-show.
But then you have problems as a brand if that's your approach. In the, that is brand damaging. If someone doesn't turn up, there's going to be a bloody good reason why they didn't turn up, and then they're going to be really aggravated because it feels completely unfair. So
raises the bar to get the reservation, right? If you have to make the commitment in the first place, and becomes more complicated in the application of that fee.
Yeah, you're right. You've got two problems. You've got some people are going to be put off booking at all, and what's the loss there? Yeah. And then secondly, if you ever have to collect that fee, I would say there's going to be some pretty bad will if the diner feels like it was an unavoidable situation.
Right, and it's a feeling of fairness, and then it feels unfair. But what we can take away from this is these base studies that originally were just the Palau Pledge now have a bunch of ways we can apply it through brand marketing.
Absolutely. And I would always argue with these studies, don't get fixated on the peripheral detail, the fact it was in an NHS surgery. Think about what is the core finding, and that would be that the bias of consistency is harnessed if we make an active commitment, not just a passive one. That underlying principle, that can be applied in lots of different ways.
Perfect. All right, so let's go to break. And when we come back, I'll share one of my favorite travel studies, and we'll go from there.
Behavioral Science for Brands is brought to you by Function Growth, Ad Age's 2023 Newcomer Agency of the Year. Your D2C business isn't broken, you're just doing it wrong. By fusing advanced technology and behavioral science, Function Growth solves the biggest problems faced by today's DTC brands. Visit us at www.functiongrowth.co to learn more.
Welcome back. In the first half of the podcast, we were talking about the Palau Pledge, but now it's time to turn to our second campaign. So, Michael Aaron, what campaign did you pick today?
I picked a campaign that I'm enthused by, but not a skier myself.
Yeah.
So Snowbird Mountain is out in Utah, and it is one of the most, according to them, easily accessible mountains in the West, and they have a very compelling campaign. We're going to drop in the notes the pictures of the campaign, but it's really counterintuitive, and I've brought my notes so I can read it out to you. Imagine beautiful picture of a mountain, beautiful downhill slope, and right on the ad, 1 star. Greg from Los Angeles reads, I've heard Snowbird is a tough mountain, but this is ridiculous. I feel like every trail was too steep and littered with tree wells. How is anyone supposed to ride that? Not fun at all. That's interesting. They're taking this idea of a negative review and they're posting it as their big advert. This is a campaign they started running in 2016, I believe. And it's really interesting because people, first, it grabs attention right away. And second, it's using a negative comment, but to prove something that could be really interesting, which is that advanced skiers are immediately drawn to the challenge of this type of slope.
Yeah, so I think you're right. It's actually fascinating. I love the point about distinctiveness.
Yeah.
Because if there is one theme to advertising, it's the ads brag. So it's very, very rare to see any admission of a problem or a weakness or a flaw. So that ad will stand out from the competition. And frankly, if you don't stand out, then the chances of you getting noticed are massively reduced. And if you don't get noticed, everything else you say is academic. It doesn't matter. You can have the most persuasive copy in the world. If you're not noticed, it's just chucked into the void.
So this campaign gets published in Ski Utah on a Monday. On Tuesday, it was Reddit's #1 post. So Clearly evocative amongst a certain age group, amongst a certain audience that really said, yeah, I'm in on the joke. I get what Snowbird's doing. As we were in London this week getting ready for the shoot, I sent a picture to you. I'm in, you call it the subway? You call it the metro?
We'd call it the tube.
The tube. I'm in the tube and I'm going from point A to point B, and I look up and there's a black advert. Yeah. I'll post the picture in the show notes. Black advert, 1 star. This and I'm trying to remember the exact words.
I think it's would not recommend. And then at the bottom it says
Satan.
Yeah,
right. It's a app. It's a advertisement for a Bible app.
Yeah.
And Satan says would not recommend. And so I think you can be in on the joke. You could see that there's a tongue-in-cheek aspect to this. Snowbird was maybe a little bit more complex because you really had to read it and understand it was a great great mountain. The Satan and the Bible app, anybody who reads it gets it.
Yeah, and actually the media choice is working well there. The Bible app is run on the tube. Those little panels that you get in the carriage, and people are sitting there for 5-10 minutes.
Yep.
There's enough time for that playfulness and the layers of an ad to be interpreted and picked up on.
Absolutely. And I think that, what's fun about it is not only is it distinctive, you notice it because it's not 5 out of 5 stars, not 9 out of 10 doctors recommend. So distinctiveness is at play. And 2, it engages the audience and they're in on the joke once they've read it.
Yeah. And what behavioural bias? What do you think the key bias at play is in this?
So, you and I talked about a few, and the one that really resonated with me was a 1993 study by Kipling Williams, and it's this idea of something called stolen thunder. So I'll share a little bit about the study, and then we could talk a little bit about it. So Kipling Williams is in the University of Toledo, and he runs a study to investigate how effective is the concept of stolen thunder. So he sets up 257 students, and they have a mock criminal assault trial. The trial's set up, and they do this trial the same way each time with one variation. In the first variation, the damaging piece of evidence about the defendant was not presented at all. So there, no thunder. Sometimes it was brought up by the prosecutor. That's what we'd call thunder, where the prosecutor says the damaging evidence and everybody hears it. That's thunder. And sometimes, in the third variant, the defense attorney says it first, the damaging evidence first, and it's repeated by the prosecutor, quote unquote, stolen thunder, because the defense admitted the damaging evidence before the prosecutor gets to it. In the instance of stolen thunder, the perception of guilt is less than when the prosecutor did it first, when there was thunder. So what do we take from that? That if we admit the flaw, if we share the piece of information first, then it takes away some of the impact that it would have if the other side gets to it first.
Yeah. I love this as a study. And I think it comes down to partly a difference between claim and action. And as the cliche goes, actions speak louder than words. Anyone can say they're innocent, any brand can say they're high quality, but any empty claim will be treated with skepticism by the audience.
Right.
But when it comes to the stolen thunder example, the defense attorney isn't claiming honesty. They are giving tangible proof. They're showing a weakness in their case. They're drawing attention to it proactively. And it's that action that generates the believability. And I think there's an awful lot that brands could learn from that. If you go out and claim your quality or your premium, consumers are going to treat that very, very cynically. But if you can do actions that prove those points, like maybe charging a really high price, that's an action that has a cost, and therefore the high price is a very good signal for high quality. To me, this is all about prioritizing action over claim, and then you as the brand get the benefit potentially. Interestingly,
just connecting from before the break, we talked about a restaurant reservation with a cancellation fee of $75 a person really does indicate a high premium value of the meal you're going to have. It also steals a little bit of thunder when you get into the restaurant and your meal is going to end up costing $150 per person. You already have that expectation of a high price point before you start. I don't know if that connects for you.
Well, there's certainly evidence that if you split costs out and people pay them at different times, it reduces price sensitivity. Yeah. Now that I think can be applied smartly, it can be applied badly.
Yeah.
Maybe the smart example is people like Amazon Prime, where you pay on January the 1st and then small amounts through the year.
Yeah.
The dangerous way of applying it is how some of the budget airlines do, where in a single session you essentially get this drip pricing.
Right, and you feel like you're never done paying.
Yeah, you're lured in with a $50 headline price, but then you have to pay for your seat, then you have to pay for your bags, and you come out paying $120.
And did you feel like you knew it was a sham all along?
Yeah, and unfortunately, there is a financial motive for those brands to behave like that. There are studies that suggest people end up paying more with drip pricing, but it comes at a cost. The perception of the brand is more damaged by drip pricing than just giving people a single head of cost. So you've got this trade-off.
Yeah, well said. I think my only point on the Stolen Thunder is if you heard there was a bigger price tag associated with even canceling the reservation, it may mitigate some of the sticker shock when you're in the room.
And I think absolutely the case. I mean, I guess when Williams is talking about Stolen Thunder, he's talking about specifically believability and credibility. You admit a flaw as a brand or a person.
Well said.
And then anything else you say becomes more believable. And I think that point about believability is super relevant to all brands because every brand has this problem of the trust gap.
That's right.
For eons, we have been suspicious of salespeople. We know if a salesperson says that their car or their olive oil or their trainers is amazing, they have a very strong vested financial interest to spin the truth. So you've got to think of tactics to close that trust gap, one of which is proactively admit a flaw in your products, ideally a minor flaw. And then once you've done that, all those other claims that you have about your product, they become more potent and more powerful.
So an example, Listerine.
Brilliant.
And that bold flavor. The campaigns are based on the fact that you're going to have an intense experience while it's cleaning or while it's doing what it does in your mouth.
Absolutely. I think their line was the taste you hate twice a day.
Yeah.
You admit you've got a problem with taste.
Yeah.
And then your claims about potency are seen as even more credible. There's a very similar, but I think I prefer it, very similar example from Canada.
Yes.
And it's Buckley's cough syrup.
Okay.
So this was a family-owned brand up until the mid-'80s, small market share. And in the mid-'80s, they changed the strap line so it tastes awful and it works. And the ads increasingly become more and more outrageous.
Right.
One of the brilliant print ads says something on the lines of, the largest bottle we'll sell is 250 millilitres. Anything else would be cruel. Yeah. They have people like drinking, hockey shirt sweat and things, to try and get across the bad taste. But the brilliant thing here is they've taken this insight of if you admit a problem, your other claims become more believable. And then that insight, they haven't just been happy with that psychological idea, they've then executed it amazingly. They've done it with consistency, and these ads have been running for 30, probably nearly 40 years, and they've done it with flair and humour. And I think there's something there for brands to learn, that just because behavioural science is based on academic studies, you don't have to just take the study and force fit it on your communications. Have fun with it. Like any other insight, once you know that idea, then apply it with a degree of flair and lateral thinking.
I think these are two very clear examples that our listeners can take and use. A third one that comes to mind, interested in your take on this, very first episode we did was Guinness's pratfall effect, admitting that it takes time for the head of a Guinness to go down before you can drink it. The strap line is, good thing come to those who wait. Similar idea.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The pratfall effect, I think, is very, very related to Stolen Thunder. I think it has a slightly different nuance in that the Stolen Thunder idea is about believability. Pratfall effect is about appeal. But they are both strengths that come for admitting a flaw. And the great thing about Guinness is, everyone, I guess it's the same with Listerine and Buckley's actually, everyone who has drank a pint of Guinness or tried Listerine, the Guinness takes ages to pour. The Listerine takes awful. So it's not like you're even telling people something they don't know. Right. So there's no downside here. They knew the fact about poor taste or weight. All you're doing is reframing how they interpret it. The weight is no longer an irritant that means that you miss 2 minutes of the conversation while your mates have gone back to the table with their lagers or their wines. The weight is a symbol of the quality of that.
Of what you're going to get. And I think that, to take this conversation and just step back for a second, one of your and my bigger meta arguments about behavioral science is not that you're going to hear something from behavioral science and necessarily do something you have never thought about. Now, that may happen, but what it gives us is the chance to have more confidence in the decisions we're making. The science behind pratfall effect or behind Solon's thunder is very well accepted and it's well tested, and there's lots of different studies that prove it. It should give our marketers confidence that they can go out and admit a little flaw and feel good about it.
So I completely agree that some marketers, some creatives have this idea already. Interestingly, if you look at the history, the first study into the pratfall effect was 1966, Elliot Aronson. But in 1959, Bill Bernbach had come out and said, a small admission gains a large acceptance. And in 1959, they ran the classic VW ad, ugly is only skin deep. In 1962, his agency ran the amazing Avis line, we're number 2, so we try harder.
Right.
So the creative director had got there 7 years before the academic. So many of these ideas will come from industry, will come from advertising. The academics are often catching up. But that said, we're not all geniuses like Bill Bernbach. Pratfall effect is not commonly applied, even though we've gone through half a dozen examples. I'm sure we could come up with a dozen more. Now, in that intervening period between 1959 and now, there have been tens of thousands of ads. The proportion that admit a flaw will be far less than 1%. So yes, some marketers know about these principles, but I think something like the pratfall effect isn't widely enough known, or certainly is not widely enough applied. Yeah.
And for those that are building campaigns, for those that are on the ground actually creating the base ideas that make the creative campaigns, this gives you another thing in your arsenal to sell it into the C-suite, to get the CMO or to get the board to say, you know what? This is not just a swing in the dark. There is science behind what we're choosing, and that should make everybody feel a little bit more confident with taking bigger risks and taking bigger steps forward and making your ads more effective, making your brands stand out more distinctively.
Yeah, I agree with that. Marketers often work in organizations that are very data-led.
Yeah.
And sometimes there is, often an unfair view that marketers are basing their ideas on intuition without rich data sets. So if you want to get buy-in from the FD or the CEO in one of those organizations, being able to take a rigorous, peer-reviewed, observed experiment like the pratfall effect or like Stolen Thunder, it gives your argument for the creative direction much more heft. Completely agree with that. It's a real big benefit of behavioral science.
Yeah. So we'd encourage everyone listening to use these things not just as interesting thought starters, but use them to sell the ideas at the end, because no one is going to hear there's data and peer-reviewed science behind the approach and discount it completely. It may not sell the whole thing for you, but it will absolutely be impactful for those that are receiving the idea.
I think that's fair.
Yeah. Okay. What else do we have before we wrap up today?
Well, we've probably got 3 key principles we've discussed today, I think. The first one was around active commitments.
Yes.
So it's the idea, a big driver of human behaviour is the need to be consistent with your past self. If you think about American politics, you can see this in action where politicians will accuse others of being flip-floppers if they're inconsistent. Our language has many, many negative terms for inconsistent people. That bias, though, is only activated if the commitment is public to some degree. Either it's written down or it's stated. And if there's that element of activeness, then you can harness consistency to your benefit. So that's the first principle. That's the Steve Martin study. We then talked about the idea of Stolen Thunder. So that's the Kipling's-Williams study, University of Toledo, this idea that if you admit a weakness in your product or your argument, that is a tangible demonstration of your honesty. Everything else you say becomes more credible. So if you want to close that trust gap, the doubts that the audience have in their mind about your believability, admitting a weakness is a very, very good way to do that. And then we finally summed up the podcast by talking about the pratfall effect. And that's a very similar idea to Stolen Thunder. It's an idea that comes from Elliot Aronson, and it's this idea that if you admit a flaw, you become more appealing, you become more likable. So there are two strong benefits to this still rarely used tactic.
Amazing. So as we come to a close, Richard, we've talked summer vacations. We've talked the appeal of how the tourism industry can help reveal some really interesting behavioral science. Do you have a favorite summer experience from your childhood, from more recently, as you think about summer times?
Yeah, I'd say favourite destination is probably the west coast of Scotland, the Highlands. I think that's one of the most beautiful places in the world. It's not always perfect in summer though, because lots of midges. But outside of that midge season, I think that's probably my favourite place to go.
Yeah.
Yourself?
I grew up in North Jersey, New York City area, and the New Jersey coastline is very beautiful. If you're from America, you have a little bit of a tinged view from a MTV show called Jersey Shore, but it really is very beautiful. You know the Jersey Shore.
I don't know the Jersey Shore. As I said, I come from Essex, and there's a very similar programme set in Essex, which I think has cast a... people have the view of Essex in the way that's not a complete representation. There are bits of it that are absolutely beautiful as well.
Yeah, as we like to say, there's a little bit of truth in every mockery, and but there's plenty of beautiful spots in Essex. Wishing everyone who's thinking about summertimes a happy summertime vacation plan. And until next time, I'm Michael Aaron Flicker.
And I'm Richard Shotton.